This decision is lawless, it's destructive, it's dangerous, it's cruel, it's illegal, and it's unconstitutional. Donald Trump has done a lot of bad things in the last week, but nothing's worse than this. That's a very responsible measure. Again, the past 4 years, we've seen the Biden administration spend money like drunken sailors. It's a big reason we've had an inflation crisis in this country. And it's incumbent upon this administration to make sure, again, that every penny is being accounted for, honestly. And those affected by President Trump's federal funding freeze have a little longer to clear up confusion over the order. A federal judge has temporarily halted it. Earlier today, Senate Democrat Chuck Schumer sharply criticized the action. Okay, so Trump's financial empire is in absolute free fall after a federal judge issued an emergency order freezing virtually all Trump Organization assets following explosive findings of systematic fraud and Trump's failure to post the massive bond required to delay a historic civil judgment that could permanently dismantle the business dynasty he's built his entire identity around. This isn't some routine legal setback. This is a court stepping in and essentially taking control of the entire Trump Organization, its real estate holdings, its business accounts, and even Trump's personal financial access. We're talking about Trump Tower Mar-a-Lago, his hotels, his golf courses, everything that has ever defined Donald Trump as a businessman. Completely frozen, completely untouchable. Trump cannot sell anything. He cannot transfer ownership. He cannot hide assets. He cannot even use his own properties as leverage to secure loans. His empire has been locked down like a crime scene. And the reason this freeze came down so aggressively is simple. Trump failed to post hundreds of millions of dollars in bond required to delay enforcement of the fraud judgment against him, a judgment that found the Trump Organization systematically inflated property values, sometimes by absurd, impossible amounts to obtain favorable loans and insurance deals year after year. Prosecutors described it as a deliberate pattern of deception that didn't just happen in the margins of the business, it happened at the very top.
Now, before we go deeper, if you're following this developing story with us and you appreciate clear, fact-driven breakdowns of what's happening inside America's legal and political landscape, make sure you subscribe to this channel.
It really does help us continue this coverage, and let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We always appreciate hearing from viewers across the country and around the world. Back to the crisis. The asset freeze isn't symbolic. It's not partial. It's not narrow. It's total. The judge's order reaches into every corner of the Trump Organization's empire.
From flagship towers in Manhattan to sprawling golf resorts in Florida and Scotland, nothing can move without the approval of the court and monitors who have now been given authority to scrutinize every financial action Trump attempts to take. For a man who has built his entire persona on the idea of dominance, control, and financial mastery, this is the worst possible fate.
Waking up one day to discover that your name is still on the buildings, but the power to control them no longer belongs to you. And here's what makes this even more catastrophic. With all assets frozen, Trump can't access equity. He can't borrow against properties. He can't shuffle assets, not even internally between his own companies, to create the liquidity he needs to pay his mounting legal bills or continue his political operations. Trump's entire business model for decades has been about maneuverability. Moving assets between entities, refinancing properties, leveraging debt. That entire playbook has now been destroyed by a single court order.
Financial experts are calling this the equivalent of pulling the emergency brake on a train going full speed. Meanwhile, Wall Street is in panic mode. Banks with outstanding Trump loans are reviewing their exposure. Insurance partners are considering whether they even want to stay associated with the organization. DoD-level accounting firms are privately warning clients that dealings with Trump entities could become unstable.
Vendors are nervous about whether they'll be paid.
Employees across Trump properties, from hotel managers to golf course staff, are bracing for the possibility of layoffs, operational freezes, or ownership changes. This isn't just Trump's problem anymore. The shock waves are radiating outward across multiple industries that have financial ties to him. The psychological toll on Trump is also likely immense. Court-appointed receivers could soon step in and run the Trump Organization as if it were a failing company in distress. They would decide which assets stay, which assets go, and if necessary, what properties need to be liquidated to pay the judgment. Imagine the Trump brand, which has been marketed for decades as a symbol of wealth and success, being stripped off buildings by court officers because the organization can no longer legally maintain them. That visual alone would be a devastating blow to Trump's political image, an image he depends on for survival in an election cycle, where strength and success are his selling points, and the political implications are massive.
Trump's campaign strategy has always relied on projecting wealth, power, and independence. But what happens when you suddenly can't pay your legal team? What happens when you can't self-fund campaign operations, can't finance rallies at the scale you used to, can't run ads in battleground states because your accounts are frozen and every dollar you spend is under scrutiny?
Donors who once viewed Trump as a strong, financially unshakable leader are now quietly questioning whether they're supporting a candidate whose empire is collapsing from the inside.
And political opponents are already crafting attack ads,
framing Trump not as a successful businessman, but as a man whose empire was built on fraud and is now being dismantled by the courts piece by piece.
This is just the beginning. The scale of what's unfolding is almost impossible to exaggerate. Trump is facing not just a financial crisis, but an existential one, legal, political, personal, and historical. And the courts are only getting started. The freeze covers everything, and the scope of it is so staggering that even seasoned legal analysts are saying they've never seen anything quite like it for someone of Trump's stature. We're not talking about one disputed property or a narrow injunction. We're talking about the legal equivalent of putting an entire corporation into a glass box and telling the owner he can look, but he can't touch. Trump's lawyers are reportedly in crisis mode, scrambling to convince the courts that the freeze is too broad, too suffocating, too crippling for normal business operations to continue. But the judge's order makes clear that this wasn't done lightly. It was done because the court believed that without such a sweeping freeze, Trump might attempt exactly what he's been accused of doing for decades, moving assets around to shield them from liability. And that's what separates this moment from previous Trump legal battles. In the past, Trump has always had room to maneuver. When lawsuits hit, he countersued. When debts came due, he refinanced. When properties underperformed, he restructured ownership or funneled money through different entities until the pressure eased. But those tactics are gone now. The court has effectively closed every escape hatch Trump has relied on throughout his business career. He can't play shell games. He can't rely on the flexibility of his corporate structure. He can't shift money quietly through trusts or LLCs. The financial maze he spent 40 years building as a shield has now been turned into a trap he cannot get out of. Meanwhile, legal observers are warning that this is only phase one of a much larger collapse if Trump can't satisfy the judgment. If he doesn't pay, and all signs suggest he cannot, then the courts have the authority to begin seizing properties outright, not just freezing. Seizing, that means forced sales. That means auctions. That means Trump Tower, the crown jewel of Trump's identity, could appear on the market not because Trump wants to sell it, but because the government is liquidating it to pay his debt. The humiliation of that alone would be unprecedented for a former president. The visual of Trump's name being taken down from buildings by order of the court would be a moment etched into political history. And the irony is brutal. Trump has spent years telling the world he's worth billions. Yet he couldn't pull together the bond required to delay the judgment. That failure tells a very different story about his actual financial health, one that lenders and risk analysts already understand. Bond companies reviewed Trump's finances and said no banks that once lent to him have walked away. Financial institutions now see him as a toxic client, too risky, too unstable, too unpredictable. When the people who analyze wealth for a living decide you aren't worth the risk, that's not politics. That's math. But the legal battle isn't just about the money. It's about the fraud findings that triggered all of this. Those findings didn't come from political rhetoric or media spin. They came from documents, accountants, statements of financial condition, internal communications, the raw materials of business operations. And what those materials revealed was a systematic pattern of inflating property values to mislead banks and insurers. Not by a few percent, not by negotiable margins, but by hundreds of millions of dollars at a time. Inflating a penthouse from 1,000 square feet to 3,000, claiming a property was worth 5 times what comparable sales, suggested creating valuations that no rational lender would believe unless they trusted Trump personally, and many did. Now those lenders are realizing the extent to which they were misled. And in private conversations, many of them are furious, not only because they may have made decisions based on false information, but because being associated with this scandal now carries reputational risk. No bank wants to explain to regulators why it continued doing business with someone whose company has been legally deemed fraudulent at its core.
And while all of this unfolds, Trump's political operation is dealing with a crisis of its own. Campaign insiders are openly worried about cash flow.
A presidential campaign costs hundreds of millions of dollars, and Trump's legal battles now consume a staggering portion of his fundraising. With his assets frozen, he cannot inject personal funds even if he wanted to, and donors, especially wealthy ones, are thinking twice. They don't want their contributions used to keep a collapsing empire afloat. They don't want to back a candidate who might spend 2025 juggling court hearings, asset seizures, and political rallies like plates spinning on sticks. They want a winner. Stability, predictability, and Trump at this moment appears anything but stable. And still the implications go deeper. Trump's entire political persona is built on the idea that he's a successful billionaire who knows how to run things. But how do you run a country when courts are running your businesses? How do you campaign on being a master negotiator when you couldn't negotiate a bond? How do you claim you built a great empire when judges are now dismantling it? That's the fight Trump is facing, not just in courtrooms, but in the court of public opinion.
As the crisis deepens, the most striking shift isn't happening in the legal arena, but inside Trump's own orbit, where allies who once projected absolute confidence are suddenly cautious, measured, even visibly rattled.
Some of Trump's longtime business associates are distancing themselves, giving polite but vague statements about monitoring the situation or awaiting further clarity, which is political and corporate speak for, this is worse than we expected and we don't want to get pulled into it. Former executives who once praised Trump's financial genius are privately acknowledging that the findings of fraud are impossible to dismiss as partisan attacks because they're grounded in paperwork his own company produced. And it's not just the insiders.
Financial analysts, real estate experts, and corporate attorneys across the country are calling this judgment a blueprint for how regulators and state attorneys general can dismantle powerful business networks that engage in fraud, even if those networks are controlled by someone as politically untouchable as a former president. This is uncharted territory, a test case that could reverberate for decades.
If Trump can lose control of his empire because of fraudulent valuations, what does that mean for other real estate empires that operate in the gray areas of valuation practices? A lot of people in the business world are suddenly nervous because if courts start applying this level of scrutiny across the board, the entire luxury real estate sector could face massive legal risk.
But while the financial sector analyzes the ripple effects, Trump's legal team is locked in a desperate scramble.
They're filing emergency motions, appealing to higher courts, arguing that the freeze is overreaching, punitive, and damaging beyond necessity. They're trying to convince judges that Trump needs access to at least some liquidity to maintain operations and pay his obligations. But the problem is simple. The court doesn't trust him. Not after the fraud findings, not after years of opaque financial maneuvering, and not when there's clear evidence the Trump organization has a long history of shifting assets, renaming entities, and restructuring ownership in ways that make it harder for creditors to collect. The court's position is effectively this. If Trump wants flexibility, he'll need to earn it by complying, not by insisting on trust he hasn't demonstrated. And looming behind all of this is the terrifying possibility, at least for Trump, that receivers could take direct control of his properties. These aren't ceremonial positions. A court-appointed receiver has real authority. They can take over management. They can approve or deny expenditures. They can restructure operations. They can sell assets if necessary. In extreme circumstances, they can even dissolve entities. If Trump Tower ends up under receivership, Donald Trump could walk into a building bearing his name only to be told he has no authority to make operational decisions. The symbolism of that is almost Shakespearean. The man who built a persona on control, power, and deal-making reduced to a spectator in his own empire. Politically, opponents are preparing for exactly that narrative. They're poised to argue that Trump cannot lead the nation when he cannot legally lead his own businesses. They're ready to say that a man whose empire is collapsing under fraud findings cannot be trusted with the federal budget, national security, or the complexities of global leadership. They're preparing to frame him not as a strong businessman, but as someone who sold an illusion of success for decades and is now being exposed in the harshest possible way. And yet, Trump's base will likely view all of this as yet another attack, another example of the system trying to crush him. But even loyalty has limits. When the structural realities start to shift, when rallies shrink because funding dries up, when advertisements disappear because cash isn't there, when legal setbacks become weekly headlines and criminal trials compete for time with campaign events. Supporters might stay emotionally invested, but financially that's another story entirely. And then there's the campaign question. How do you run for president when your attention is divided between political combat, legal strategy, and financial triage? Trump has always thrived on chaos, but this isn't the kind of chaos he controls. This is chaos imposed on him. Courtrooms, judges, prosecutors, creditors, financial monitors. It's a world where Trump can't dictate the pace or the narrative, a world where he's reacting rather than dominating. And history shows that when Trump loses the ability to control the storyline, his political strength weakens. The stakes are enormous, not just for Trump, but for the country. Because if this crisis escalates, and every sign suggests it will, we may soon be witnessing something no American has ever seen.
A former president and current presidential candidate watching his entire financial empire be either frozen, dismantled, or sold off under court supervision while he campaigns for the most powerful office on earth.
It's unprecedented. It's destabilizing, and the outcome is far from clear. As this financial disaster grows, another dimension of the crisis is starting to take shape. The psychological unraveling that comes when a man who built his identity on wealth, power, and control suddenly faces the real possibility of losing all three at once. People close to Trump say the mood around him has shifted dramatically. He's oscillating between defiance and panic, between promising total victory on appeal and privately demanding to know how this could have happened.
For decades, Trump operated in a world where lawsuits were just another form of negotiation, where financial setbacks were temporary inconveniences that could be handled with aggressive lawyers and creative accounting.
But this time, none of those tricks are working. And for the first time, the consequences aren't limited to a single property or a single deal. They're engulfing everything. The psychological impact of that cannot be overstated. Trump has always presented himself as untouchable, as someone who could bend systems to his will, as a businessman who always finds a way out. Yet now judges are issuing orders he cannot counterbalance. Financial institutions are refusing to back him, and prosecutors are laying out findings of fraud so detailed that even his most loyal defenders struggle to ignore them. It's a crisis that strikes at the core of his mythology, not just his finances, but his identity. Meanwhile, the political world is bracing for the next stage of fallout. Campaign strategists from both parties are treating this like a political earthquake whose aftershocks will shake the entire 2025 and 2026 cycles. Democrats see an opportunity to redefine Trump permanently, not just as controversial or divisive, but as fundamentally fraudulent, someone whose entire business reputation was built on lies and deceit. Republicans, on the other hand, are terrified of being dragged into the collapse.
Some fear that being too closely tied to Trump could place their own campaigns at risk, especially in competitive districts where voters want stability and credibility, not a candidate associated with a collapsing empire and a legal firestorm. Behind closed doors, GOP officials are asking questions that would have been unthinkable even a year ago. Can Trump actually make it to Election Day financially intact? Can he legally serve if his assets remain under court control? And perhaps most importantly, will the party be forced to step in if the financial and legal situation spirals to a point where Trump becomes too compromised to continue? These are the conversations happening quietly, cautiously, out of public view, but they're happening. And then there's the broader question. What happens to the Republican brand if Trump's business empire is dismantled in real time during a campaign? The GOP has spent years aligning itself with Trump's persona as a successful businessman who represented strength and prosperity. If that image collapses completely, the political cost could be enormous. The party could face a crisis of identity, forced to distance itself from the very figure who reshaped it. At the same time, financial regulators and legal scholars are studying this moment as a potential turning point in how courts handle business fraud, especially involving figures who operate high-profile enterprises with complex webs of subsidiaries. The message being sent is unmistakable. No amount of fame, influence, or political power exempts someone from legal accountability. And if Trump's empire can be frozen, monitored, and forced into potential liquidation, then no business titan is beyond reach. But the most immediate consequence, one that could unfold at any moment, is the possibility of a forced sale. If Trump cannot secure the funds to satisfy the judgment, the court can authorize receivers to begin selling off pieces of the empire. And if that happens, it will be done at market prices, not Trump-inflated valuations. Buildings will go for what they're actually worth. Properties will be assessed by independent professionals. And the Trump brand will be evaluated not through self-promotion, but through the hard reality of market demand.
That process would expose in the most public and humiliating way possible the difference between Trump's claims about his wealth and the actual financial reality behind the curtain. And it wouldn't just be a loss of money. It would be the dismantling of a persona that Trump spent his entire adult life crafting. The golden towers, the lavish estates, the image of success, all of it tethered to his political identity, all of it now vulnerable to seizure. As this crisis accelerates, one thing is becoming clear. Donald Trump is no longer fighting simply to preserve his wealth. He's fighting to preserve the image of himself that he has spent decades selling to the American public. Because if the courts take that away, if they take the towers, the golf courses, the hotels, the brand, what remains is a question Trump has never allowed anyone to ask without the empire, without the illusion of unmatched success. Who is he? And can he survive politically without the myth that made him? The next phase of this crisis will answer that question. And the stakes for Trump, for the political landscape, and for the country could not be higher. And that brings us to the most unsettling truth in all of this. We are watching a former president's financial empire collapse in real time. Not because of politics, not because of partisanship, but because of the courts, the evidence, and the rule of law. This is not spin. This is not campaign messaging. This is the judicial system laying out piece by piece what it believes actually happened inside the Trump organization for decades. And as these consequences unfold, Trump is finding himself boxed in from every angle. His assets are frozen. His lenders are gone. His legal fees are skyrocketing. His campaign is struggling for oxygen. And now, for the first time in his public life, the thing he has always relied on, money image, the myth of invincibility, is slipping out of his hands faster than he can grab it. But the real question, the one this country will have to grapple with, is what happens when someone whose business is crumbling, whose finances are under judicial control, whose legal liabilities are growing by the day, still wants to be president of the United States? What happens when the pressures of private collapse collide with the powers of public office? What happens when a political campaign becomes, in effect, a shield against financial ruin? Because that is where we are now. Not speculation, not theory, reality. A former president running for office while judges control his assets, creditors circle like sharks, and prosecutors pursue cases that could redefine the limits of presidential accountability. And whether you support Trump or oppose him, whether you believe he's being unfairly targeted or simply facing long overdue consequences, the fact remains these next months will determine not only the fate of one man, but the strength of the legal system itself. Will the courts hold? Will the rule of law stand? Or will political pressure overwhelm everything? We don't know yet. But what we do know is that this moment right now is unlike anything in modern American history. A business empire on the brink, a presidential campaign under strain, a legal battle that could reshape the presidency for generations. And as this story continues to unravel, one thing is certain: what comes next will change.